Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, Stefano, and thank everybody for this invitation to speak here today for this Ethics for Tech course. Good evening, everyone. I hope that Fabio's introduction has not raised too many expectations about this presentation. Today, I will talk about the Gamergate and especially the psychology of Gamergate. And I am really pleased to be able to discuss with you the topic of my seminar, which is the Gamergate, indeed, because I believe that the problems raised by new digital environments are complex problems, and therefore solvable only if we tackle them by uniting and comparing different points of view. As Fabio anticipated, my background is in philosophy and history of science, but today I teach mostly psychology. And since this year, psychology of digital environments too at the University of Rome Tor Vergata. So, what I'm about to tell you is an example of what I believe to be the need for psychology and humanities in general. The need for psychology of 21st century to question the kind of transformations that we are experiencing across the globe through the rise and explosion of information and communication technologies. And we have to do this, in my opinion, so that we can better understand what is alive and what is dead in the classical theories of psychology and philosophy when we compare them to this new form of human interaction and human digital environments interaction. I apologize if you are hearing a cat making meow on the background, but it's my cat and I can stop it because it has learned that when I am talking online, he can do whatever the noise he wants. So please apologize me and Ettore for the background noise. So let's start with brief outline of my talk. Of course, always feel free to intervene to ask clarifications or questions, both via chat or by opening the microphones. I will begin by introducing the phenomenon of Gamergate, framing it temporally or historically, if you prefer, and highlighting some of its main protagonists. Moreover, I would like to dwell on the fact that Gamergate should not be taken as a single case, but rather considered as a real paradigm both of what we are used to call firestorms, or more commonly shitstorms, and of the largest and most dangerous 8 campaigns run by subversive political organizations all around the globe. Next, I will try to correlate the Gamergate phenomenon with some classical concepts in social psychology, in extension stereotypes, prejudices, attitudes and behaviors, in order to verify whether the established models used so far in my discipline are still effectively valid. When we apply them, of course, to the new forms of interaction that are proper of digital environments. Finally, I would like to discuss with you the implications that the presented scientific literature may have both on the development of new researches in digital psychology and on the creation of new ethical reflections about technology. So, let's take a view on what the Gamergate was or is. It depends on the fact if you consider it concluded or not. Gamergate, the name comes from the hashtag Gamergate, which marked the posts and content used by the Gamergate supporters. It can be defined as an organized harassment campaign against women in the video game industry. Yes, it's true that Gamergate supporters and proponents pretended that their actions were aimed to criticize the video game industry and video game journalism. For example, one of their slogans was, "We are bringing back ethics in the video game industry." But notwithstanding these claims, the movement immediately revealed itself as the widest online firestorm of all times, conveying misogyny, homotransphobia, and hate for the so-called social justice warriors that are people, mostly activists, that are involved in bringing discussions, reflections about themes of inclusion in contemporary media and digital culture. Now, it is very important to remember that Gamergate has never been an organized movement in the classical sense. Even if it has received support from stable and recognized organizations in the far-right digital circles, Gamergate has always been characterized by its fluidity. We will see that this is one of the most important features to take into account when thinking about phenomena like this. For this reason, it has also been difficult to study the Gamergate through the typical methodologies of psychology, for example. And I think that this is very important. This seems very important to me. For example, in many of the researches that I will present today, techniques of data mining, sentiment analysis, and semantic categorization have also been used, together with the most classical methodologies we employed in psychological research. And again, I think this is a clue to the direction that new technology studies should take. I mean, we should move towards a real and renewed interdisciplinarity, and this is the reason why I am so happy to be here today. Now, this was a general framing of the Gamergate controversy, and in this slide you will find the three most important protagonists of Gamergate. Three women active in various branches of the video game industry, and all three victims of Gamergate. The first, in the biggest picture, is Zoe Quinn, an American video game developer, programmer, and writer who developed the interactive fiction game Depression Quest that was released in 2013. This game was a very peculiar one, dealing with themes like depression, that was a mental illness that Quinn suffered from. And in 2014, it was a blog post by Quinn's ex-boyfriend that sparked the Gamergate controversy. The following year, in 2015, Quinn co-founded Crash Override, a crisis hotline and a resource center for victims of online harassment. The second one, the top right, is the journalist and video game critic Anita Sarkisian, one of the first to take side and analyze the Gamergate phenomenon. She's a Canadian-American feminist, media critic, and public speaker, and she is also the founder of Feminist Frequency, a website that hosts videos and commentary analyzing portrayals of women in popular culture. She has received particular attention for the video series Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, which examines tropes in the depiction of female video game characters. For these, Sarkisian was also subject to threats and forced to change a lot of her private and working life. Just consider the fact that she had to suspend several seminars in many US universities for the level of danger of the tweets received. In fact, until recently, and maybe also today, talking about Gamergate in an academic context meant to secure a place among the targets of Gamergaters. Especially if you are a woman, of course. On the bottom right, finally, you can find another video game developer, Brianna Wu, who later also ran for the US Congress with the Democratic Party, also helping to bring this kind of issues into the American political debate. Now, after the introduction of the main protagonists of this tragic story, here is a brief timeline of the main events around which the Gamergate has developed. On August 6, 2014, Iron Johnny, Quinn's ex-boyfriend, published the Zoe post on WordPress, accusing video game developer Quinn of infidelity. The post was shared to 4chan's board and other forums, and in a couple of days, a campaign against Quinn was coordinated, eventually resulting in Quinn's doxing on August 19. Via the QR code on the corner of this slide, you can access to an archived, to a stored version of the Zoe post on WordPress. If you read it, you will find that Joni attacked Quinn not just for her presumed cheating, but also for having, according to Joni, having had an affair with a video game journalist from a very famous website that is Kotaku, dedicated to the world of video game. For those of you that don't know the meaning of the term doxing, but I guess that everybody knows what I'm talking about. Doxing is the practice of collecting documents and personal information, leaking them and share them on the internet in order to make possible for other people to send threats against the victim. Just a few weeks later, on August 25, video game critic Anita Sarkisian became another major target for Gamergate because of the post that I was mentioning before. Later, she contacted the FBI in order to denounce death threats against her and her family. On October 10, also video game developer Brianna Wu was driven from her home by death threats. Now, in addition to these arbitrarily chosen dates, you should know that starting on October of 2014, the American and international media also began to take a position with respect to the Gamergate controversy. Later, it was revealed that at the request of Brianna Wu, the FBI opened an investigation file, which lasted several years without particular judicial outcomes, but nevertheless important for the awareness of public opinion and legal institutions with respect to the new forms of violence typical of digital environments. Just one consideration, I won't talk in this seminar about issue related to backlashes on mental illness of victims. This is not an attempt to deny. On the contrary, I am very aware of the tragic and terrific consequences that a victim of hate speech and shitstorms online can suffer and can experience. But I think that just for talking about this, we will need an entire course because it's something that has been very covered by literature in the clinical psychology field. Okay, so I will only focus myself and my speech on the cognitive and social cognitive models behind this kind of phenomenon. Okay. So let's get back to the presentation, and in order that you can understand what the Gamergate was, I will let you read some typical messages of the so-called movement for ethics in video games. Of course, I won't read these tweets aloud, if only because I find them disgusting. They are appeal and claims to horrific crimes and like rape and violence and assassination and murder. But I would like to draw your attention to the numbers as well as the tone of the messages. In October of 2014, the programmer Andy Biaso wrote a little Python script with the Twython wrapper for the Twitter streaming API. And he started capturing every single tweet that mentioned the Gamergate hashtag from October 21 to October 23 of that year. 3 days later, he collected 300,000 and more tweets, along with an equal amount of metadata. Out of this vast number of tweets, almost 200,000 of them, the 69%, were retweets. The remaining less than 100,000 tweets were original ones. Almost the half of these weren't directed to anyone. Almost 40,000 were replied directly to other users, and almost 12,000 publicly mentioned one or more users. He noticed that Gamergate was unusual in one respect if compared with other firestorms. In fact, many of its proponents were using newly created, often pseudonymous accounts, and this has led a part of the public opinion and some scholars to think that they were sock puppets, fake accounts used just in order to spread specific target contents. And apart from this, I just want you to understand that this kind of storm, more than 300,000 tweets in just 3 days, this phenomenon, the Gamergate, lasted for months, if not years. It is true that even though officially the last fires of Gamergate and the related hashtag died out around 2016, if we can consider the fall in frequency of this hashtag as an extinction, it is also important to note that the world of video games has still experienced several controversies, although not in similar forms necessarily, related to gender issues. One example out of all is the following one. I don't know if you are gamers. I am one. I'm not a hardcore gamer, but when I have some spare time, I really like to play video games. And I don't know if you know the game from which this screenshot is taken. The game is called The Last of Us Part 2. It is considered a masterpiece by Naughty Dog. It was published in 2020. I personally found it a masterpiece in terms of narrative and gameplay. Rarely have I seen so much psychological depth in the characterization of characters in a video game, for example. The game was released on June 19, 2020. The critics acclaimed it as a very fine piece of art, with an average score in ranking of 96 on 100. But in the reviews of the public began to flourish a 0 out of 100 degree. So what happened? Immediately, over more than 44,000 users posted a negative review of The Last of Us 2 on the popular aggregation site Metacritic. They didn't do so because they didn't like the game. It was impossible for them to have played it, having released just a few hours earlier. But the actual reason was the fact that the main character that you can see depicted in this photo is a lesbian. And many critics and scholars has seen what happened around The Last of Us Part 2 as one of the backflame of Gamergate. But there is another, maybe even more important phenomenon that happened after the Gamergate, and that has a lot of common features with the Gamergate, and I'm talking about the attack on Capitol Hill of January 2021. This is an excerpt from an interview to Brianna Wu on just a few days after the Capitol Hill attack, and she said, "Everything I tried to get to the FBI to act on in the aftermath of Gamergate has now come true. We told people that if social media companies like Facebook and Reddit did not tighten their policies about these communities of organized hate, that we were going to see violent insurrection in the United States. We told people that these communities were organizing online for violence and extremism. That, unfortunately, has proven to be true." This is something that I really want to stress because I think, together with a lot of scholars, not exactly in my field, but in the field of cybercrime and cybersecurity studies, that we can consider Gamergate as the main and most important. I am using a term that is a lot overloaded in philosophy, but I think that it's right in this context. Gamergate was a paradigm for online hatred campaign of the next years, especially during the Trump administration in the United States. And I think that if we want to speak in technological terms, we can call it a prototype. It has been the perfect prototype, one of the perfect sandbox for some movements to see how violent ideas and violent practices could spread online and eventually take forms in physical life. Even if I know that the distinction between physical and digital is thinner and thinner day after day. However, apart from the political and historical relevance, that is something that I really value when talking about these, it's also important to see that this phenomenon is actually relevant also for psychology and ethics. Speaking about psychology, I think that Gamergate gives us a chance to check if some popular assumptions in psychology are still valid and consistent for the psychology of digital environments. And moreover, the psychological debate can provide additional elements for the development of new and consistent ethical reflections that can grow up from an actual and real, in a Marxian sense, dialectical interaction with the technological reality, the new technological reality. This was the introduction to my seminar. I hope that now you have a hint of what the Gamergate was. And now I am gonna explore some possible connections between classical models that we have developed and employed especially in the field of social psychology during the last half of 20th century, in order to see if they can be considered valid also when talking about these kind of phenomena that are proper of a new environment. Okay, so what I have to say now, I want to proceed by pointing out that in almost all cases, the researchers behind the literature that I'm going to present started from a series of clichés typical of the so-called folk psychology. I don't know if you know the meaning of folk psychology. Folk psychology, or sometimes common sense psychology, is the set of psychological theories and assumptions that we infer by our human capacity to explain and predict the behavior and mental state of other people. Of course, folk psychology is not scientific psychology, even if sometimes theories from both these approaches to the mind can overlap. For example, think about statements like opposites attract. That's not true, since experimental science, experimental psychology shown that it's more the contrary, and birds of a feather flock together. And still, when we think about intimate relationships, a vast majority of us think of opposites attract, like a sort of psychological effect ruling our behavior. A common assumption of folk psychology is that attitudes can predict behavior, and that people come together precisely on the basis of common attitudes. Now, since Gamergaters used to frequent and proliferate on environments like 4chan, The immediate idea is that there might be a correspondence between the typical 4chan frequenter type and the Gamergate supporter. For those of you who don't know, 4chan is an image board website launched in 2003, which was originally used for posting pictures like lolcats and so on, and discussing manga and anime, but later it became an incubator for alt-right movements. The site has often courted criticism and media attention due to its anonymous community and the presence of explicit content, most of the times, or at least many times, behind legal laws and rules. So, most of Gamergaters use 4chan, and later they moved to other similar image boards like 8chan, that is, if possible, even more related to certain political environments. And they did so in order to spread their hate speech. Later, it's however important to understand that they moved, just like the whole alt-right movement did. They moved also to Twitter and other popular social network websites. Of course, before these big tech companies decided to ban some kind of behaviors on their platforms. So one of the first questions that psychologists ask themselves when approaching the study of Gamergate was: should we correlate the alt-right movement to the Gamergate, or in other words, are people having attitudes that we can label as alt-right attitudes? Do they share Gamergate theories and assumptions and attitudes? So, to better understand these, let's clarify the concept of attitude and its relationship to behavior. In psychology, an attitude refers to a set of emotions, beliefs, and behaviors toward a particular object, person, thing, or event. Attitudes have different components. There is a cognitive component, for example, thoughts and beliefs about a subject or an issue. An affective component, that it means how the object or the issue makes us feel, and a behavioral component, that is the way by which attitude influences your behavior. Now, when we think in non-scientific terms, in extension, in folk psychology, we tend to assume that people behave according to their attitudes. However, social psychologists found that attitudes and actual behavior are not always perfectly aligned, and this is something that we will discuss in a few minutes. The fact is that this seems to be the case with Gamergate. There is no perfect alignment between attitudes and actual behavior. In fact, a recent study by Ferguson and Glasgow, 2020, tried to measure individual features and personal traits of Gamergaters in order to see if we could be able to establish a correlation between average alt-right supporters and Gamergater supporters. It is true that individuals fitting in what is called the alt-right constellation of individual traits, Caucasian, male, heterosexual, and non-Hispanic, it is true that people identifying with these features were more common than those in other categories, but only the 41.8% of the sample identified by as all of these categories. And this suggests that many Gamergaters do not fit the stereotype of a heterosexual white man. This is important because if we look at the data, the demographic and background traits of Gamergate supporters are much more diverse and heterogeneous than one might expect. Of course, there could be a bias in the survey. This is a problem that happens often in psychology, and one that only replication of studies can mitigate, actually. But it is still significant to note that the authors of this study took very rigorous precautions to avoid biased responses. I think that this is very important, especially if you look at the last part of this column, that referring to political views of participants in the survey. As you can see, a lot of them, the majority, consider themselves liberal or extremely liberal. So these, it is true. Bias is possible, actually, but I think that we should not make too much trust on the correspondence between attitudes, political attitudes, and actual behavior. For example, in cases like the Gamergate controversy, because the simplistic idea of a correlation between an alt-right type and the Gamergate type just do not seem to be supported by the data. And this is not too bad, because psychologists will say that. Besides, as I mentioned before, we already knew that the relationship between attitudes and behavior can be more complex than that. About this point, there is one study that I want to mention, for Lapierre's 1934 study, that was crucial in this regard. Stanford sociologist Richard Lapierre is best known for his 1934 article that was called "Attitudes versus Actions," that appeared in the journal Social Forces. Lapierre spent 2 years traveling the United States by car with a couple of Chinese ethnicity. During that time, they visited 66 hotels and 184 restaurants, and they were turned away only once. Then, at the conclusion of their travels, Lapierre mailed a survey to all of the businessmen they visited with the questions: "Will you accept members of the Chinese race in your establishment?" The available responses were yes, no, and depends upon the circumstances. Of the 128 people that responded, 92% answered just no, notwithstanding their own previous behavior, their own previous actual behavior. This study was seminal in establishing the gap between attitudes and behaviors, and subsequent controlled experimental recording on this subject validated Lapierre's hypothesis and make this one of the tenets of social psychology. Attitudes don't predict behavior. So the relationship, in order to improve the model behind the attitude-behavior relationship, other theories and other models were developed. The theory of planned behavior, that you can see schematized here, is a psychological theory that links beliefs to behavior. The theory maintains that 3 core components, namely attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, together shape an individual's behavioral intentions. This theory suggests that attitudes are only one of 3 categories of belief: attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived control, and all together they can predict behavioral intentions that in turn predict the actual behavior. For example, you may also have a negative attitude toward cheating, but be more likely to cheat if you perceive that cheating is the subjective social norm. For example, if you say to yourself, everyone else is cheating, so I might as well do it too. And if you think that you can get away with cheating, this is perceived control, then you are more inclined to cheat on your partners. The theory of planned behavior is actually very important because it has given us the possibility to reintroduce an efficient model of attitudes and beliefs and perceived control in relationship to behavior. But one of the factors that is classically considered crucial in inhibiting the perceived control is, of course, anonymity. It is important to understand that Gamergate grew mostly on digital environments like 4chan, whose interface's focus was on anonymity. It is true that it was not true technical anonymity, as the site logs the IP addresses, but the interface does not reveal them, so we can experience at least a sensation of anonymity. According to the so-called the individuation theory, anonymity contributes to an individual's loss of self-awareness and the loss of concern for self-evaluation within a group setting, enabling the individual to participate in anti-normative or aggressive behavior. This is something that has been popularized by, for example, studies and researchers like Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment of 1971, where people were camouflaged by prison guards, and after a few days, 4 days, Zimbardo had to interrupt the experiment, to stop the experiment, because the level of violence within the simulation was had raised to unimaginable levels. And however, there are also other forms of anonymity that have been classically studied in psychology and social psychology. For example, there is a famous article of 1973, if I am right, if I remember well, by Gergen and Gergen, two American psychologists that wrote this seminal article called Deviance in the Dark. They shown that if there are no cue triggering for violence, the effect of the individuation makes you feel more open and tender towards strangers and people that you don't know. But the triggering factor for this kind of intimacy was the fact that all these subjects were in a dark room with no light, so that they could not see each other in the face, and this created a sense of lower in the self-awareness and a disinhibition in behavior. So again, we can ask ourselves, it is anonymity to blame for the explosion of the Gamergate? And actually the answer is no. Of course, I think that everybody knows what we call the online disinhibition effect, the lack of restraint one feels when communicating online in comparison to communicating in person. It is true, people feel safer saying things online which they will not say in real life, because they have the ability to remain completely, even if completely anonymous is maybe an exaggeration when talking about digital environments, but we have the feel of being invisible behind our computer screen. But this is not related to anonymity per se. In a 2016 study by Rost et al., the analysis of a major social media platform concerned with public affairs, it's Twitter, over a period of 3 years was made, entailing 500,000 comments on 1,600 online petitions. Results shown that in the context of online firestorms, non-anonymous individuals are more aggressive compared to anonymous individuals. In reference to each possible variable, in fact, the most aggressive behavior is systematically manifested by non-anonymous users rather than by anonymous ones. This, in fact, is also the case of Gamergate. Apart from the sock puppets used in the campaign, that were anyway a minority compared to the real users. This effect seems to be reinforced if selective incentives are present and if aggressors are intrinsically motivated. Then we can ask ourselves what kind of motivations can be involved in this mess. I think that two factors are the most important ones here, and they are intertwined. I think that they are identity on one hand and social acceptance or conformity on the other hand. Just please remember the fact that I don't have the time to talk about identity, especially identity in digital environments, because it's something that is very complex, and I don't want to state something that it has to be confirmed. The problem of speaking about and lecturing about the psychology of digital environments is the fact that we started to do it only recently, and for a very long time, for all the first decade of 21st century, when we spoke about cyber psychology, we were talking about an application of psychological models to digital goals, namely marketing. Okay, most of the cyber psychology of the first decade of 21st century just left out any phenomenological approach or any theoretical approach. They just try to make psychological model and marketing goals meet in order to maximize the efficiency of for example, online shopping websites or social networks. And we are starting to create a global network that is interested in the development of a new psychology, of digital environments just recently. So I am quite sure of the fact that we are gonna rediscuss what I'm talking, we are talking about today in a few years, but this is a risk that we should accept. We have to start from a point. After all, we cannot just expect that we will produce a useful amount of literature in just a few years. This is the scientific process that you know very well, just like everybody here in this class. So I will left the identity discourse apart, but I will focus on the question of the issue of social norms. Just let me make clear that these two topics are very intertwined. The construction of our own identity is social in its nature, and I love to remember one of the most important fathers of psychology, of Western psychology, that was William James, the American philosopher. He said that when we are talking about the self, we are talking about our body, our actions, our home, our car, the clothes that we wear, and everything that extends our cognition is part of ourselves. So for a political and social species like the human being, like Homo sapiens, it is clear that a lot of the information and influence that shape our identity come from our interaction with others. In this respect, we have to consider that the new way of interactivity, or as somebody has called interpassivity, that are properly owned by the digital environments, have a very strong influence on the determination of our own identity. And focusing on social norms, I want to introduce to you the so-called social norms theory. The social norms theory describes situations in which individuals incorrectly perceive that the attitudes and the behaviors of their peers or other community members are different from their own. The phenomenon has also been called the pluralistic ignorance, And it is important to understand that the social norms theory is a very is an upgraded version of theories and models about conformity. It states that our behavior is influenced by misperception of how our peers think and act. The main the most useful example that was also the issue behind the development of this model is alcohol consumption. If you take the average university population made up of students, you will see that a lot of people overestimate the frequency and the quantity of alcohol assumption of their peers. Put simply, every student thinks that the other students drinks a lot, even if it is not true. And this is important because if I think that every other people around me have specific social norms, I will try to conform to these social norms. And this is the reason why, for example, we know that overestimations of problem behavior in our peers will cause us to increase our own problem behaviors, and the underestimations of problem behavior in our peers will discourage us from engaging in the problematic behavior. This is very important here because if this approach, the approach that tried to create an epistemic frame to understand phenomena like the Gamergate or other form of violent online firestorms has been proposed by the authors of the study that I mentioned before, Ross, Stale, and Frey in 2016. Of course, if you want, I have prepared a folder with all these papers so that you can read them directly, and I can send them to Professor Fossa at the end of the lesson. And I think that this is important because even if we have to disconfess the fact that anonymity or the classical attitudes behavior relationship arose, for example, by the theory of planned behavior, are to discard when we talk about these phenomena that are typical of digital environments. Rost and colleagues shown brilliantly that the social norms theory can actually apply to this kind of phenomenon, and I think that this is important, and in a way it also reveal, or at least it also proves, but no, maybe it's not a proof. It is an evidence for my case, an argument for my case, because social norms are learned. Social norms are introjected by education, formal and informal education. And this is the reason why, if we already know that social norms theory can be applied to this kind of phenomenon, this means that we can also intervene by thinking about and then creating a cultural and social and societal environment that is aimed to the development and the teaching of different form of respects. It's not something that is very rooted in the hardwired part of our brain, just making us act on the basis of our biological centered cognition. Okay. And I think that this is very important because this can be one of the first common fields where psychology, the psychology of 21st century and ethics of 21st century can interact. However, I just don't think I am exhausting the issue here. Not least because I think we should strongly consider a number of other structural features, structural in the sense of Karl Marx, technical and practical and material features that can exert an influence on our cognition. These features definitely have a strong impact on the behavior and cognition of active subjects in a digital environment. And just to make a list, as an example, it's likely that all of the factors mentioned in this table are at work in this phenomenon, and we should really all be working together over the next few years to test them one at a time and in conjunction with each other. Just to name a few of them, and please note the fact that this kind of features have been studied in the past, in the second half of 20th century. Of course, not relating this model to the digital environments. So again, we have to try to test and stress all theories, classical theories, in order to see if they are still consistent and valid today. For example, we should reflect on the speed and volume of communication that has dramatically increased with the recent development of ICTs. We have to reflect on the false dichotomies of binary choices in digital environments. In my course of psychology of digital environments, we had a very deep and important discussion with my students, and we decided that we had to include non-binary genders in when making surveys or making qualitative measurements of cognitions or specific behaviors. And I think that it's very important to remember that from an ontological point of view, digital environments are completely artificial environments, and this means that even if impersonality is the sense that they convey, in fact there are people behind it. As you know much better than me, there are people behind the technology. And why this is so important? Can I suggest a book to read that I really found exciting and illuminating? It's The Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener. She is the tech correspondent for The New Yorker, and she worked in the editorial industry, the publishing industry, but later she moved and eventually she became one of the HR for GitHub, and she experienced she too the wave of toxic masculinity within the video game industry. But I think that everybody in the STEM disciplines should read her book, because probably it's one of the most brilliant memoir clarifying how we should consider the mentality and the ideology and the personality of people behind the internet, especially behind the first phase of the internet, the so-called Silicon Valley era, in the determination of certain subtle but pernicious features of the digital environments. So this is one of the first consideration, but let me get back to the list, and I swear I'm almost finished. We should take into account also network clusters. We are getting used to call them filter bubbles, but we also have to take into account the fact that for the very first time we are exposed 24 hours, 7 days a week to an unrestrained information flow, and this has consequences, at least on a cognitive level. We already know that. Furthermore, there is, for example, and this is something that again calls philosophy into account, we also have to reflect about what kind of changing, what kind of transformations are fostered by the fact that we have made the border between what is online and what is the real life thinner and thinner, and eventually the online life and the real life just overlapped and superimposed each other, and giving birth to what the philosopher of information at the University of Oxford, Luciano Floridi, named the on-life, life of human being. And this also is a challenge from the point of view of psychology, because again, psychology of digital environments in the last decade concentrated itself on trying to apply what was considered consistent and valid in the past to the new forms of interaction proper of the digital environments. But actually, this was not just a possible translation. The truth was that the mixing of these two realms of our life just imposed a sort of transformation, and we have completely to revisit what we know about, for example, anonymity or other form of disinhibition that we considered as something already stated and already acquired from a psychological point of view. I end the reading of the list. And I want I want to make some final remarks of you. I was very excited. I ran a lot. Sorry, Fabio. I didn't want to, but I was excited and started to talk really fast. Even if this that I presented today to you is just a starting point. It's just a case, an example, a case study in order to understand that we should again put in discussion what we have done until now. I think that this small example that I brought today to you can help us understand how crucial an interdisciplinary effort around the technological and digital world is, if we are not to find ourselves caught up in an infosphere that we are unable to understand or govern. Eventually, phenomena like Gamergate should make us rethink about the consistency of established psychological models in the new setting of digital environments. And it is important also to remember that data analysis and their interpretation can be extremely useful also to the construction of a new ethics of technology, which in turn could guide further psychological researches. So I want to thank you for your attention. Just feel free to contact me for discuss this topic or other related topics again. And these are my email addresses and my website. And now, if you want to put some questions, make some questions, or express your opinions, I will be glad to hear you and to start a debate.